The wind turned against Evelyn Brooks so fast that the gold aspen leaves stopped drifting sideways and began flying straight at her face. And that was the moment she knew she was going to die on that mountain road, unless someone found her. She had left the relay hut above Ironbridge Crossing only an hour before beneath a sky so blue and bright it seemed painted on. The aspens along Split Rock Canyon burning gold and copper in the October sun. And she had thought, foolishly, that autumn in the Colorado high country was the gentlest season she had known since coming west. Now the sky had gone the color of a bruise, snow was slashing sideways instead of falling, and the trail she had walked twice a week for 11 months had disappeared beneath a white blur that erased every landmark she owned. She pulled her cloak tighter and pressed on, one hand trailing along the granite shoulder of the mountain, because she dared not lose contact with something solid. The leather satchel with the decoded telegraph message clutched to her chest, as if it were a living thing she had to protect from the cold. Her boots, city-made and city-soled, slid on ice that had not existed when she left the hut. She called out once, uselessly, her voice snatched away by wind that howled down off the peaks like something with a grudge. Then a shape came out of the white. It was enormous before it was anything else. A column of buckskin and dark wool moving with the sureness of a man who had never once doubted where his own feet were. And when it resolved into a face, it was a face she had never seen in Ironbridge Crossing, weathered brown, a heavy dark beard flecked with melting snow, and hair longer than any man she had known back east, tied at the nape of his neck with a leather cord and whipping loose in the storm regardless. He had shoulders that seemed to block out what little gray light remained, and forearms bared beneath rolled sleeves despite the cold, corded with the kind of muscle that came from years of splitting wood and hauling deadfall and not from any gymnasium. "Do not move another step," he said, and his voice was low and even, pitched to carry through wind without needing to shout. "There is a drop 6 feet past where you are standing, and you cannot see it." She froze exactly where she stood, her heart slamming. "Who are you?" she called back, because it seemed the only sensible question left to ask a giant who had appeared out of a blizzard to tell her she was about to walk off a mountain. "Hugh Colter," he said, closing the distance in 3 long strides, and then his hand was around her upper arm, not rough but absolute, the grip of a man who intended that she would not fall no matter what the mountain tried. "You are the telegraph woman from the bridge." "I am the toll keeper," she said, teeth beginning to chatter now that terror had loosened its grip enough to let the cold in properly. "And the telegraph operator. Both, actually. Ironbridge Crossing cannot afford to pay 2 salaries. Something that might have been the beginning of amusement moved behind his eyes, though his face did not properly smile. "Well, toll keeper and telegraph operator, you are also about a half-mile from freezing to death on a shelf trail in a squall that came down off Notch Peak faster than any storm I have seen in 9 years living under it. We are not debating your employment. We are getting off this mountain." "I was returning from the relay hut," she said, as he turned her bodily and began walking her back the way he had come, one arm now settled solid across her shoulders, angling her body against the wind and against his own bulk so that the worst of the gale broke over him first. "I have a message that cannot wait. It concerns the Tanner girl." "Every message can wait until you are not dead," he said. "Walk, do not talk. Save your breath for your legs." She wanted to argue. She was not accustomed to being told to hold her tongue, not after 4 years working the key in a Philadelphia rail office where she had earned the respect of men twice her age through nothing but speed and accuracy, and she opened her mouth to say so. But the wind chose that moment to shove her sideways into him, and his arm caught her weight without so much as a stumble, the way a man catches a dropped tool rather than a falling person, without alarm, only correction, and she found she had nothing clever left to say. They went on like that, him breaking trail, her hand fisted in the front of his coat though she had not decided to put it there, the snow thickening around them until the world was reduced to his shoulder, and the sound of his boots crunching ahead of hers. She could not have said how long they walked. Time became the rhythm of his steps, and the ache building in her thighs, and the burn of cold air dragged into her lungs. Then, abruptly, the wind eased, cut off as if a door had shut, and she realized they had come under the eave of a low log structure built into the mountain's flank, half a dugout and half a proper cabin, smoke already curling faint and gray from a stovepipe, though the fire inside could not have been lit more than minutes before he'd left it to come find her. "This is my line shack," Hugh said, pushing the door open and steering her through it ahead of him. "I keep it stocked for exactly this kind of foolishness. Sit by the stove. Do not argue with me about that either." She sat because her legs had begun trembling in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with cold finally being allowed to matter. He crouched at the stove and fed it split pine until the little cabin began, gradually, to fill with heat, and only then did he turn and look at her properly, sweeping his gaze over her without a trace of impropriety in it, only assessment, the way she imagined a doctor might look at a patient. "You are not hurt," he said. "Good. Now tell me why a woman with sense enough to hold a job like yours walked out onto that ridge road, when the leaves were dropping backward on their branches an hour before the storm hit." "I did not know that was a sign," she admitted. "It is the only sign that matters this time of year," he said, and something in his tone was not unkind, only certain, the certainty of a man who had lived under these particular mountains long enough that they had taught him their language whether he wanted to learn it or not. "When the leaves turn and fly against the grain of the wind that's blowing them, the true wind is about to change behind it. My grandmother taught me that on a ridge not 4 miles from here, and she was right every single time until the day she died." "I will remember it," Evelyn said, and meant it, filing the knowledge away with the same automatic precision she used for a Morse pattern. He studied her another moment, water dripping from the ends of his hair onto his collar, and then he said, "You said something about the Tanner girl." Evelyn's hand went to the satchel she had not once let go of, even walking blind through the storm. "Lucy Tanner sent a telegram 3 nights ago from the relay station at Bell Fork, 40 minutes before the line there went dead. It was addressed to her aunt in Denver. Reeves Garrick told the town she had been taken, that natives or road agents carried her off from the toll road, and he organized men to search the eastern canyons. But the message I decoded says nothing about being taken. It says she left on her own, that she has proof her guardian has been stealing from her father's estate for 3 years, and that she is trying to reach someone in Denver who can help her before Garrick finds her first." Hugh went very still. "You are certain of that decoding?" "I have transcribed thousands of these," Evelyn said, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I am certain." Outside, the wind screamed against the shack's log walls, and somewhere in the white beyond the door, a 15-year-old girl was still out there, alone, hiding from a man with money and standing, and every reason in the world to want her silenced before she reached anyone who would listen. The storm kept them in the line shack through the night. Hugh Colter built up the fire until the little room glowed amber, hung her sodden cloak on a peg near the stove where it steamed gently, and produced, from a shelf crowded with dried bundles of yarrow and willow bark and something that smelled sharply of pine pitch, a tin cup of something bitter and hot that he pressed into her hands without asking whether she wanted it. "Drink it," he said. "It will keep the chill from settling in your chest." "What is it?" "Boneset and a little whiskey. It will not kill you, and it will help you sleep." She drank it, made a face at the bitterness, and caught, for just a moment, the corner of his mouth lifting at her expression before he turned away to check the door latch against the wind. "You are a physician," she said, less a question than an observation, watching him move around the small space with the economy of a man who had organized every inch of it himself, dried herbs hanging from the rafters in labeled bundles, a mortar and pestle worn smooth with you sitting beside a row of corked bottles. "There is no physician within 60 miles of Ironbridge Crossing," he said. "There is only me, and what my grandmother taught me, and what I have learned from every mistake since. Folks call me a healer. I mend what I can, and I am honest about what I cannot. That is not a small thing to be honest about." He looked at her then, longer than the moment required, as if he had expected her to say something else, something softer or more ornamental, the kind of thing he imagined an educated woman from the East might say to flatter a rough mountain man for the sake of politeness. When she only held his gaze, plainly, waiting, he seemed to recalibrate something behind his eyes. "You are not what I took you for when I saw you on that road," he admitted. "And what did you take me for?" A woman who had wandered somewhere she had no business being, and would need carrying the rest of the way. "I did not require carrying," Evelyn said, an edge in it now. "I required a guide who knew the mountain better than the storm did. There is a difference, Mr. Colter, between a woman who is lost and a woman who is helpless, and I would ask that you learn to tell them apart before you decide which one I am." He was quiet a moment, and then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, low sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. "Fair," he said, "fair enough. I will grant you that." They talked longer than either of them likely intended, while the wind worked itself into a fury outside and then, gradually, wore itself down toward exhaustion. She told him, because he asked plainly and did not seem to expect a performance of grief, that her father had been a rail superintendent in Philadelphia, who had died 2 winters ago of a fever that no Eastern doctor had been able to break, and that she had taken the Iron Bridge crossing post, because it was the farthest position from home the telegraph company offered, and because she had wanted badly to prove to herself that she was more than a well-mannered clerk with good penmanship. He told her more slowly that his wife had died of a fever herself 6 years back in this same country, and that he had known every remedy in his grandmother's book and none of them had been enough, and that he had spent every season since learning 10 new things so that the next time death came calling on someone he loved, it would leave with less than it wanted. "I am sorry," Evelyn said quietly. "So am I," he said. "It does not stop being true just because time passes over it." Neither of them said anything more about it. But something had shifted in the small cabin. Some understanding passed between two people who had each buried something and kept walking anyway. And when Evelyn finally slept, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled of pine smoke and dried sage, she slept without dreaming of the storm at all. The morning came clear and hard-edged, the sky scrubbed to a pale and merciless blue, 6 inches of new snow lying over the gold and rust of the fallen aspen leaves like a shroud thrown carelessly over something bright. Hugh Colter walked her the rest of the way down to Iron Bridge crossing himself, refusing to let her attempt the ice-slicked shelf road alone, and by the time the bridge came into view, its heavy timber trusses spanning the gorge with the river 100 feet below running fast and black between snow-dusted boulders, Evelyn Brooks had decided 2 things. The first was that Hugh Colter was the most maddeningly certain man she had ever met. The second was that she had not felt so entirely, physically safe in longer than she could remember, and that the feeling frightened her rather more than the storm had. Iron Bridge Crossing was not a large settlement, perhaps 60 souls counting the freight men who came and went with the supply wagons, but it survived entirely on the strength of one bridge and the toll road that fed it, the only crossing for 11 miles in either direction over a gorge too steep and too fast to ford. Everything the settlement ate, burned, or sold came across those timbers, and the man who controlled the toll contract, and the freight schedule, and very nearly the town council besides, was Reeves Garrick. He was waiting on the porch of the toll house when Evelyn and Hugh came down off the mountain, a heavy-set man in a good wool coat with silver at his temples, and a way of standing that suggested he believed the ground beneath him belonged to him by natural right. "Miss Brooks," he said, before she had even reached the steps, "I trust you did not attempt to send that telegram of yours before verifying it properly." Wild accusations in a moment like this can do a great deal of harm to a search effort already underway. "I verified it 3 times, Mr. Garrick," Evelyn said. "The message is not an accusation. It is Lucy's own words in her own hand, transmitted from Belfork 3 nights past." "A message you claim to have decoded," Garrick said, and there was something practiced in the way he let a note of gentle pity into his voice, the tone a man uses when he wishes a room to believe a woman is overwrought. Grief does strange things to a young mind, Miss Brooks. I have known Lucy since she was in short dresses. I do not believe for one moment that girl ran off of her own will, and I will not have this town's search effort turned aside by a garbled cipher some Eastern operator half-froze on a mountain thinks she read correctly. The cipher was not garbled, Evelyn said, her voice steady though her hands had gone cold with anger rather than weather. I would be glad to have it examined by anyone in this territory competent to read a telegraph line. Hugh Colter, standing a half-step behind her with his arms crossed over that considerable chest, said nothing at all, but something in the flat, patient way he was looking at Garrick made the freight man's eyes slide sideways and not quite settle. It was Judge Alden, arrived that same week to hold circuit court in the settlement's single meeting hall, who finally put an end to the argument 2 days later. He was a spare, silver-haired man with a lawyer's habit of letting silence do half his talking, and when he had heard both Evelyn's transcription and Garrick's protest, he folded his hands on the table before him and looked at the room over the top of his spectacles. Miss Brooks has 11 months' service on this line without a single recorded error, the judge said. Mr. Garrick has offered this court no evidence of abduction beyond his own certainty. A search party under Mr. Garrick's direction has spent 2 days searching the eastern canyons and found nothing, which is unsurprising, since Miss Brooks's transcription places the girl heading west, toward Bell Fork and the Denver Road. I am ordering a proper search along that route, Mr. Colter. He turned his gaze to Hugh. You know this country better than any man in this settlement, and you owe no allegiance to Mr. Garrick's freight contracts. Miss Brooks holds the only accurate account of where that girl is headed, and this office cannot spare men to relay telegraph traffic for her at every way station along the way. You will go together. Garrick's face had gone the color of old brick. Your Honor, with respect, sending an untrained woman into that country in the middle of a mountain autumn is reckless in the extreme, and I will not have Colter's reputation as a healer used to lend credibility to a scheme that— That will do, Mr. Garrick, Judge Alden said mildly, and something in the quiet of it closed the subject entirely. This court has ruled. Garrick left the hall without another word, but Evelyn saw in the doorway the look he threw back at her, and it was not the look of an innocent man merely inconvenienced. It was the look of a man doing arithmetic on how much trouble she was about to become. They set out the next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. 2 horses and a pack mule loaded with what Hugh judged they would need for 4 days in country that could turn deadly with no more warning than it had given Evelyn on the ridge road 2 days before. The aspens along the toll road burned gold in the low light, and beneath the beauty of it Evelyn found herself watching the leaves the way Hugh had taught her, alert for any that moved wrong against the wind. You are watching the trees, he observed, amusement plain in his voice as their horses fell into pace side by side on the wide first stretch of trail. I intend to be useful to you, Mr. Colter, not merely carried along behind you. I never said you would be carried. You implied it rather thoroughly on the day we met. He was quiet a moment, guiding his horse around a fallen limb with an unconscious ease that made the animal seem an extension of his own body. I have spent 9 years learning that most folks who come into these mountains from somewhere else do not survive their own ignorance of them, he said finally. It was not an insult to you specifically. It was a fear built out of every burial I have had to help dig. Then let me earn a different opinion, Evelyn said, instead of assuming I have already failed to. He glanced sideways at her, something in his expression that was not quite a smile but was moving toward one, and said, All right, tell me, telegraph woman, what do you make of the sky? She studied it, the way she had studied every message that had ever come across her key, looking for the pattern beneath the surface. It is clear, she said slowly, but there is a haze low along the western peaks that was not there yesterday, and the air smells of something, though I could not say what. Ice, Hugh said. It smells like ice before it falls, though you will not hear that from anyone who did not grow up with it in his lungs. We have perhaps 2 days of clear travel before this season's second storm comes down off the divide. We should move faster than I intended. They rode harder after that, following the description in Lucy's telegram toward Bell Fork, a relay station 3 hours north, where the girl had sent her last message before the line there had gone silent. The land climbed and fell in long shouldering ridges thick with lodgepole pine, and stands of aspen so bright they seemed lit from within. And twice they crossed streams running fast and cold, with the first meltwater of the season's early snow. Hugh always going first to test the footing, always turning to offer Evelyn a hand across even when she had already proven, twice now, that she could manage a horse through moving water without his help. "You do not have to catch me every time," she told him at the second crossing, though she had let him take her hand anyway and did not examine too closely why. "I know I do not have to," he said. "I want to." The plain honesty of it left her without a retort, and she found herself smiling instead, and found him watching her smile with an expression that made her look away first, toward the trail ahead, before the moment could grow into something neither of them had agreed to name yet. Bell Fork's relay station was a single-room log building with a plank porch, empty when they arrived, the telegraph key inside cold and the line running out through the window snapped clean about 4 feet from the wall, the copper wire dangling and swaying faintly in the wind. "Cut," Evelyn said, crouching to examine the break. "Not weather damage. Look at the ends. This was done with a tool." Hugh knelt beside her, running his thumb over the sheared copper. Someone did not want any more messages leaving this station. "Garrick," Evelyn said. "Or men working for him." Hugh straightened, scanning the small clearing around the station with the focused attention of a man reading sign the way she read cable traffic. There. Boot prints, 4 sets, none of them Lucy's, coming in from the south road 2 days back and leaving north, toward the high pass. He crouched again near the porch step, touched something half buried in the churned mud, and lifted a scrap of pale blue calico, torn and mudded but unmistakably a fragment of a girl's dress. "She was here," Evelyn breathed. "After the men came, or before?" "Before," Hugh said, examining the ground more carefully. "Her tracks go under theirs in 2 places. She came through first and they came after, following her, not the other way around. She is running from them and they know it, and they are close enough behind her that they are not bothering to hide their trail." Something cold settled in Evelyn's chest that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Then we are not looking for a lost girl anymore," she said. "We are racing men who mean to catch her before we do." Hugh Colter looked up at her, and for the first time since the storm on the ridge, she saw something like real fear move behind his steady eyes, not for himself, she understood, but for a 15-year-old girl alone in country that killed the careless even when nobody was hunting her. "Then we had best not lose," he said, and swung back up onto his horse. They rode north through the afternoon and into the blue hour before dusk, following the trail Hugh read from broken branches and disturbed frost, and once, a smear of blood on a stone that made Evelyn's stomach drop, until Hugh examined it and pronounced it a rabbit taken by a hawk, nothing more. They made a cold camp that night in a stand of pine, no fire, on Hugh's insistence that smoke could be seen for miles in the still evening air, and he would not risk announcing their position to 4 armed men, when the girl they were chasing had already had 2 days' head start on being frightened of exactly that kind of smoke. "You are good at this," Evelyn said quietly, huddled in her blanket close enough to him that she could feel the warmth radiating off his body, even without a fire between them. "Reading the ground, reading the weather, all of it. I have had a good deal of practice being alone out here," Hugh said. "It teaches a man to notice things, or it teaches him nothing at all and he does not last long enough to matter. Is that why you never married again?" The question left her before she had fully decided to ask it, and she felt her own face heat despite the cold. "I am sorry. "That is not my business." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might simply let the question pass unanswered. Then he said, "I did not marry again because I did not think there was a woman alive who would want a man who spends half his year in a shack in the mountains talking to dried plants, and because for a long while I did not think I deserved to try again after I could not save the first one." He paused. "I'm beginning to wonder if I was wrong about both of those things." Evelyn did not trust her voice enough to answer that directly, so instead she said, "I came west because I wanted to be somewhere no one had already decided who I was going to be. I did not expect to find a mountain man who would tell me plainly when I was wrong and mean it kindly." "I do not always mean it kindly," Hugh said, and she could hear, even in the dark, that he was almost smiling. "No," she agreed. "But you are learning to." They rode into the second day with the haze along the western peaks thickened into a definite gray wall, and Hugh's pace grew more urgent, less willing to stop, until near midday they crested a long ridge above a narrower feeder canyon and saw, far below along the near bank of the creek, a thin curl of smoke rising from beneath a rock overhang. "That is not our men," Hugh said, studying it. "Too small a fire, too well hidden. Someone who does not want to be seen either." They left the horses tethered at the ridge and went down on foot, quiet as the terrain allowed, and it was Evelyn who saw her first, huddled beneath the overhang in a torn blue dress with a man's oversized coat wrapped around her, a girl with dark tangled hair and enormous frightened eyes who scrambled backward against the rock the instant she saw movement, a rusted kitchen knife shaking in her grip. "Lucy," Evelyn said gently, holding both hands out empty, in plain sight. "Lucy Tanner." "My name is Evelyn Brooks. I am the telegraph operator at Ironbridge Crossing. I read your message. I know what your uncle has been doing, and I know you did not run off because anyone took you. You ran because you were trying to save yourself." The girl's eyes darted between Evelyn and the enormous bearded man standing a few feet behind her, and something in her face crumpled all at once, 3 days of terror finally finding an edge to break against. "You believe me," Lucy said, in a voice raw with disuse. "Nobody was going to believe me. He told everyone I was taken. He told everyone I was dead probably by now, so no one would keep looking for the truth of it." "I believe you," Evelyn said, and crossed the last few feet to kneel in front of the shaking girl, close enough that Lucy finally let the knife fall and grabbed instead for the front of Evelyn's coat the way a much younger child might have. "I believe every word of what you sent, and Judge Alden believed it enough to send us after you instead of letting your uncle's men find you first." "His men are close," Lucy said, pulling back, eyes wide with new alarm. "I saw them yesterday on the ridge above the fork. 2 of them with rifles. I do not think they mean to bring me back to town to explain myself, Miss Brooks. I think Uncle Reeves means for me not to be found at all." Hugh Colter, who had been scanning the tree line above them the entire time without ever fully turning his back to it, said quietly, "Then we do not stay here talking. There is a way station 4 miles down this creek with a supply wagon kept for freight runs. We can be inside a proper shelter with a locked door and a defensible position before dark if we move now." Lucy nodded, wiping her face with the back of a filthy hand, and let Evelyn help her to her feet, and for the first time since they had set out from Ironbridge Crossing, Evelyn Brooks felt the shape of the whole ugly truth settle fully into place. This had never been a rescue from wilderness or savagery. It was a rescue from a man who wore a good coat and stood on porches like he owned the ground beneath them, and who had built a lie large enough to send a town's sympathy chasing shadows in the wrong canyon, while his hired men hunted down the one witness who could unmake him. They had gone perhaps 2 miles down the creek, moving as fast as the uneven ground and Lucy's exhausted legs allowed, when the first rifle shot cracked off the canyon walls and sent a spray of bark exploding from a lodgepole pine not 4 feet from Hugh's shoulder. "Down!" Hugh roared, already moving, sweeping Lucy off her feet with one arm and shoving Evelyn behind the shelter of a granite outcrop with the other, his own body turned toward the ridge above where the shot had come from. A second shot followed, closer, and Evelyn heard the whine of it pass somewhere overhead. "How far to the way station?" she called, crouched low, her heart slamming. "Too far to run in the open," Hugh said, scanning the terrain with the same fast, cold focus she had seen him use reading trail sign, except now there was an edge of something fiercer in it, something that made her understand, in a single clarifying instant, exactly how dangerous a man like Hugh Colter could be to anyone who threatened what he had decided to protect. "There is a supply road half a mile east that switches back down to the same way station. If we can reach the wagon shed there ahead of them, we can put distance between us faster than they can follow on foot. Evelyn, can you drive a team? I have driven a delivery wagon through Philadelphia traffic at rush hour," Evelyn said. "I can drive a team." "Then that is the plan." He looked at her for one long charged second, some silent calculation passing behind his eyes that she understood with a jolt was him weighing whether to trust her with exactly the kind of danger he had spent their whole acquaintance trying to shield her from. Whatever he decided, he did not say it aloud. He only nodded once sharp and said, "Move when I move. Stay low. Lucy, you are with me." They broke from cover in a staggered run, Hugh angling wide to draw the next shot away from the two women, and Evelyn's lungs burned as she pushed her legs faster than she had ever pushed them in her life, half carrying Lucy's weight when the girl stumbled, until the log walls of a small way station shed rose up out of the trees ahead of them, and Hugh wrenched the door open and shoved them both inside before turning to slam the heavy plank bar across it. Inside, a covered freight wagon stood hitched to a rested team of two heavy horses, exactly as Hugh had promised, kept ready by the freight company for exactly the kind of emergency resupply runs that justified the toll road's existence in the first place. "Get her up on the seat," Hugh said, already working the brake loose. "Evelyn, take the reins. I will open the far doors and clear the road." There was no time to argue about who should be doing what. Evelyn climbed up, gathered the leather reins into her hands with the same instinctive care she gave to a telegraph key, feeling out the mood of the team through the tension in the lines. And when Hugh hauled the shed's far doors open and swung himself up into the wagon bed beside Lucy, rifle he had pulled from beneath the seat now cradled ready across his knees, Evelyn snapped the reins and sent the team lurching out onto the narrow supply road at a pace that made her own stomach drop. The road ran along a shelf blasted into the canyon wall a generation before, wide enough for one wagon and no more, the mountain rising sheer on one side and falling away on the other into a drop that ended, hundreds of feet down, in the white churn of the river. Behind them, shouts rang out, and a horse's scream, and another rifle shot that struck the wagon's rear gate with a splintering crack that made Lucy scream and Evelyn's hands go white on the reins. "Do not slow down," Hugh called over the wind and the pounding hooves. "There is a bend ahead where the shelf narrows. Take it wide on the mountainside. Do you hear me, Evelyn? Wide on the mountainside, not the drop." "I hear you," she called back, and did not dare take her eyes off the road to look at him, though she felt with startling clarity the full weight of what he was trusting her with, the two lives in the wagon bed behind her, the horse's churning speed, a road with no room at all for a single mistake. The bend came up faster than she expected, the mountain wall curving hard to the left while the shelf itself seemed to narrow to nothing at all on the right, gravel crumbling visibly off the outer edge, where the wheels of 100 freight wagons had worn it thin. She hauled the team left, felt the wagon's outer wheels skate for one heart-stopping instant on loose scree, felt the whole vehicle tilt, and threw her weight against the brake, and the rein together the way some instinct she did not know she owned told her to, and the wagon groaned, shuddered, and came back down flat onto the road with a jolt that rattled her teeth. Behind them a second rifle crack rang out, and this time she heard Hugh grunt, a short, sharp sound of pain that turned her blood cold even as she kept the reins taut and the team moving. "Hugh," she called, not daring to turn. "I am well enough," he called back, voice tight but steady. "Graze along the arm, nothing that will stop me. Keep driving. We are nearly to the fork." They came around the second bend at a speed that would have terrified her a week ago, and there, ahead, the shelf road widened out again and dropped down through a stand of pine toward the main canyon road, and behind them the sound of pursuing horses had begun, at last, to fall away, whether because the riders had thought better of that narrow shelf at speed or because the wagon had simply outpaced them. Evelyn did not slow until the trees closed in properly around them and the road beneath the wheels turned to level, packed earth, and only then did she draw the team down to a walk and finally allow herself to look back. Hugh sat braced against the wagon's side rail, one hand pressed to his upper left arm, blood seeping dark through the buckskin sleeve, but his face when he met her eyes held nothing but a kind of fierce, startled pride. "You held that bend better than half the freight drivers on this route," he said. "I have seen men twice your years put a wagon wheel over that edge going half your speed." "You are bleeding," she said, already climbing down, already moving toward him with the same automatic decisiveness she brought to a broken telegraph line, something to be assessed and repaired. "It is not deep," Hugh said, though he let her push his sleeve back without further protest, and Lucy, wide-eyed but steadier now that the wagon had stopped moving, scrambled to help hold the fabric aside. The wound was a shallow furrow along the outside of his upper arm, ugly but not dangerous, the bullet having passed through muscle without lodging. "What do I do?" Evelyn said, and heard, with some distant part of her mind, how strange it was to hear herself ask that question of a man who had spent their entire acquaintance so far being the one who knew what to do. "There is yarrow in the small tin in my saddle pack," Hugh said, wincing as she pressed her own folded handkerchief hard against the wound to slow the bleeding. "Dried, crushed fine. Pack it into the wound, then bind it tight. You have watched me do it twice now on the trail for smaller cuts. You know the motion." She found the tin, and her hands, though they trembled at first, steadied the moment she began the work, packing the dried herb into the shallow furrow the way she had seen him do for a scraped knuckle 2 nights before, then binding it with a strip torn from her own petticoat because it was the cleanest cloth available, wrapping it firm, and even the way she had watched, without realizing she was learning, on every evening of their journey so far. "There," she said finally, sitting back on her heels, and found him watching her with an expression she had no ready name for, something between astonishment and a kind of tenderness that made her suddenly, fiercely aware of how close they were kneeling in the bed of a stolen freight wagon with a rescued girl watching them both. "You did that well," Hugh said quietly. "Better than I could have managed on myself." "I have been paying attention," Evelyn said, and heard how unsteady her own voice had gone. "You are not the only one who notices things, Hugh Colter." "No," he agreed, and reached up slowly to brush a strand of hair back from her face with his uninjured hand, his fingers rough and warm against her cheek. "I am beginning to understand that quite thoroughly." Lucy, watching the two of them with the frank interest of a 15-year-old who had just survived being shot at, and was not about to pretend she hadn't noticed the moment happening in front of her, said, "Are you two going to keep looking at each other like that? Or are we going to finish getting to Ironbridge Crossing before it gets dark?" Hugh laughed, a real laugh this time, startled out of him, and Evelyn felt her own face heat as she climbed back up onto the driver's seat, though she found she was smiling too wide to properly scold the girl for her boldness. They reached the edge of Ironbridge Crossing as the light was failing, the settlement's few lamps glowing gold against the coming dark, and word of their arrival ran ahead of the wagon like a spark along dry grass. By the time Evelyn drew the team to a halt outside the meeting hall, half the town had gathered in the road, drawn by the sight of the missing girl sitting upright and alive in the wagon bed, and by the sight of Hugh Colter with a bloodied bandage on his arm, and by the unmistakable absence of Reeves Garrick's own search party, which had returned that very afternoon, empty-handed, from the wrong canyon entirely. Judge Alden came down the meeting hall steps himself, and it was to him that Lucy Tanner, still wrapped in a stranger's coat, told the whole of it in a voice that grew steadier with every sentence, the missing ledger her father had kept before his death, the false accounts her uncle had built atop it, the marriage he had arranged in secret to a man in Leadville who would pay handsomely for a young bride and ask no questions about where her inheritance had gone, and the men with rifles who had chased her 3 days through the mountains rather than let her live long enough to say any of it aloud. Reeves Garrick did not wait to hear the whole of it. He was already moving toward the livery when Hugh Colter, one arm bound and bloodied, caught him by the collar with the other and set him down hard against the hitching rail with no more effort than a man swatting a fly. And it was the town marshal, arriving at a run, who finished the job of putting proper irons on him, while Garrick sputtered protests that not one person standing in that road troubled themselves to believe. The ledger, when the marshal's men found it 2 days later hidden behind a false panel in Garrick's office safe, told the rest of the story plainly enough for even the most stubborn holdouts in town to accept. 3 years of steadily bled inheritance, a forged guardianship extension that should have ended the year Lucy turned 14, and a signed agreement with a Leadville businessman that made Judge Alden's mouth go thin and hard when he read it aloud in open court a week later, sentencing Reeves Garrick to the territorial prison at Canyon City for a term the whole settlement agreed was, if anything, too short for what he had done. Evelyn's own vindication came quietly, almost as an afterthought beside the greater drama of Garrick's downfall, but it mattered to her all the same. The telegraph company's district supervisor, summoned by wire to review the whole affair, praised her transcription as some of the cleanest field decoding he had seen in a decade of service, and made a point, in front of half the town, of shaking her hand and calling her Miss Brooks with a respect that had a different weight to it than politeness alone. She found, standing in the crowded meeting hall accepting that handshake, that she did not much need the validation for herself, not the way she once might have. She had already proven what she needed to prove, out on a mountain shelf with a wagon team in her hands and 2 lives behind her, and everyone in that room simply happening to agree with her afterward was a pleasant formality rather than a necessity. Lucy Tanner had nowhere in the world that was properly hers. Her aunt in Denver wrote back within the week, warm and sorrowful and entirely unable to take in a 15-year-old girl, being herself 71 years old and caring already for an invalid husband in 2 cramped rooms above a milliner's shop. The Leadville arrangement was, of course, dissolved the moment word of Garrick's arrest reached that quarter, the businessman in question suddenly and conveniently unavailable for any further correspondence on the subject, which suited everyone involved. There was talk, briefly, of sending the girl to an orphan asylum in Denver, and it was Evelyn who put an end to that talk before it had properly begun, standing in the meeting hall with her chin lifted, and her voice steady in a way that made Judge Alden look at her with real interest. I will not see that girl handed to strangers in a city building when she has people right here in this settlement who already know her and love her, and have already proven they will go through a mountain storm and a canyon shelf road under rifle fire to keep her safe, Evelyn said. If the court will allow it, I would take her in myself. You have no home of your own beyond the toll house, Miss Brooks, the judge observed, not unkindly, and that is a working post, not a household. It was Hugh Colter who spoke then, rising from the bench where he had been sitting with his bandaged arm resting on his knee, and his voice, when it came, was steady in a way that told Evelyn he had already decided something, somewhere between the canyon shelf and this room, that he had simply been waiting for the right moment to say aloud. Then let her have a home that is both, Hugh said. I have a cabin above the settlement with more room in it than one man needs, and a healer's practice that keeps me traveling less than I once did, and I find, Your Honor, that I have spent 9 years alone in these mountains and have discovered, only this past week, exactly how little I care for the arrangement any longer. He looked then, not at the judge, but at Evelyn, and the whole crowded hall seemed to fall away from around the 2 of them. If Evelyn Brooks would have me, I would build a life at Ironbridge Crossing worth living in, with room enough in it for Lucy Tanner besides, and I would consider myself the most fortunate man in this territory for the privilege. The hall had gone entirely silent, 60 pairs of eyes fixed on the toll-keeper, and the mountain man standing amid the wreckage of a scandal they had unraveled together. And Evelyn found that her hands were trembling not from fear this time, but from something so large and so warm that she could barely draw breath around it. "You are asking me that here," she said, half laughing, half undone, "in front of the entire settlement, with your arm still bandaged from a bullet wound. I have never once managed to be sensible about the timing of anything since the day I found you on that ridge road," Hugh said. "I do not intend to start now." "Then yes," Evelyn said, and the word came out clear and certain, carrying across the whole hushed hall. "Yes, Hugh Colter, I will have you, and I will have that cabin, and I will have Lucy besides, and I would like it very much if we did not wait very long to make it all official, because I have spent a great deal of my life waiting for things to be sensible, and I find I am finished with that entirely." The hall erupted then, applause and a few whoops from the freight men at the back, and Lucy Tanner, sitting in the front row with her hands pressed to her mouth, burst into tears that were, this time, entirely happy ones, and Judge Alden, watching the whole scene over the top of his spectacles with something that looked remarkably like satisfaction for a man of the law, banged his gavel once, mostly for the pleasure of doing it, and declared the court's business for the day concluded. They were married 3 weeks later, in the last golden days before the season's true winter closed the high passes for good, in the meeting hall decorated with the last of the aspen boughs Lucy had gathered herself, gold leaves pinned along the windowsills and the doorframe until the whole room seemed to glow. Judge Alden, delayed in the settlement by a docket of business Garrick's arrest had left behind, performed the ceremony himself, and stood afterward at the edge of the gathering with a cup of cider in his hand looking, for once, entirely unlike a man accustomed to keeping his own counsel. Evelyn wore a dress of pale blue wool, practical and warm against the mountain chill, with a spray of the last late asters pinned at her collar, and when Hugh Colter took her hands in front of the whole settlement, his own hands, calloused and enormous and gentle as they had been from the very first moment he had closed one around her arm on a storm-blind ridge road, she found she could not stop smiling long enough to say her vows properly, and had to be prompted twice by the judge. To the great delight of everyone gathered. "I have spent 9 years learning every remedy this mountain had to teach me," Hugh said, his voice rough with an emotion he made no effort now to hide, "and not one of them ever taught me how to mend the particular kind of lonely I had gotten used to living inside. You did that without meaning to, the first night I found you in a storm and thought I was the one doing the rescuing. I have come to understand since then that you saved a good deal more of me than I ever saved of you, and I intend to spend the rest of my life being grateful for it. You taught me that strength and gentleness are not opposites, Hugh Colter," Evelyn answered, "and that being capable does not mean I must always be alone in it. I came west to prove I did not need anyone to tell me who I was. I did not expect to find a man who never once tried to tell me, and loved me exactly as I already was instead. I will spend my life being glad of that too." They moved, the 3 of them, into the cabin above the settlement before the first true snow of the season sealed the high passes, Lucy Tanner given her own small room built onto the back with lumber. The whole settlement had turned out to help raise in a single generous weekend, and Evelyn kept her post at the toll house and telegraph line, walking down each morning along a trail she now knew as well as Hugh knew it, watching the leaves for the signs he had taught her. Never again caught unaware by a storm that turned against her without warning. On the evenings when the wind came down hard off Notch Peak and rattled the cabin's shutters, Hugh built up the fire the way he always had, and Evelyn sat close against his side with Lucy curled nearby, mending a torn hem or reading aloud from one of the books Evelyn had carried west and never had caused to open until now. and the three of them listened to the storm rage outside walls that held, warm and solid, against everything the mountain could throw at them. Evelyn had come west believing she needed to prove she required no one, and had found instead, in a mountain healer with gentle hands and unshakable arms, and in a runaway orphan girl with a fierce and steady heart, exactly the family she had never known she was looking for. And Hugh Colter, who had spent 9 years certain the mountains had already taken everything from him worth keeping, discovered that a woman brave enough to walk into a storm for the sake of a message no one else believed had walked, in the same breath, straight into the empty center of his life, and filled it so completely that he could no longer remember, nor did he wish to, what the silence before her had ever sounded like. The bridge across Split Rock Canyon still stood, as it always had, the single vital thread holding Ironbridge Crossing to the rest of the world, and the toll house at its near end still glowed with lamplight on autumn evenings when the aspens turned to gold. But it was no longer only a post Evelyn Brooks kept out of duty. It was the first thread of the life she had built for herself, on her own terms, in a country that had tested her and found her equal to it, and standing beside a man strong enough to carry a stranger through a blizzard and gentle enough to let her carry her own weight ever after, she thought, watching another October sunset burn gold over the canyon, that she had never once regretted the storm that had stranded her on that ridge road, because it had walked her, one careful step at a time, straight into the truest shelter she would ever find.